You have just seen that the term bottomless pit was used to hide the actual term abyss, which in historical context in the New Testament, was a reference to the Roman place of the dead, also known as the catacombs in Rome. You have seen that the reference to locust was invoking a prophecy against an imperial army from Assyria, and was how the Roman Byzantium army was described in terms of their devastation, and how they really actually physically looked with their barded horses. You have seen the reference to scorpions, was a very famous Roman military weapon, which the Vatican actually began calling by the term crossbow because of its identification in Revelation 9. And you saw that the reference that counter-reformationists take as suspension of death, was really an insult by John over how the Roman Byzantines would venerate and worship death on the one hand, but on the other hand, make it illegal. And so we have seen in our examination of the first three topics, that a very consistent theme is emerging. These prophecies are talking about Rome. Not the end of the world, not Muslims, not aliens from outer space, not liberals, communists, Jews, or a future America, or England, but Rome. Rome's place of burial, Rome's cavalry, and Rome's weaponry. John is still discussing Rome. And he is discussing the future of Rome in context to the future demise of the Nicolaitan city of Antioch, as the eastern capital of the Roman Empire. John is discussing a future army of the Roman Empire, under a new military order which he describes in verses 1 through 12. The second army is described by John as God's judgment on this first army, which is, as he describes them in verse 1, a Luciferian army, headed by the Antichrist. What would motivate a preacher to make a career out of lying to the public about a text in the Bible? You are about to find out, in the next section on having Apollyon as their king. When you see things in society that appear odd, or are done habitually and ritualistically, with no explanation or perhaps very shallow ones, do you ever ask yourself, why? Have you ever wondered why there are things like the Bohemian Grove in modern societies? Or where did all the Luciferians, all over the world, actually come from, or why they exist? Have you ever wondered why there is something called the Illuminati? Or why Christ is frequently shown in traditional church art, with long blonde hair and blue eyes? You might be surprised to discover, there is one thing behind all these different things, one thing that is related to them all. We even have an entire class of highly paid professionals, whose job is to do nothing more than make sure it stays that way. And these professionals victimize millions of innocent people by intentionally deceiving them into very spiritual acts and occult rituals, for which they have given no informed consent. They train the masses to do these things, and never ask or think about what, or why, they are even doing them. All of this is threatened and exposed by just 20 Greek words. Just 20 words. If you count out the letters and spaces, it comes to 119 characters. Or specifically, a string of letters and spaces that is only 119 characters long. They are possibly the most powerful and explosive string of 119 letters on the earth. They are the equivalent of a societal nuclear code. A red button that has the moral, spiritual and intellectual power to reduce that entire secret society construct to ashes, along with the millions of its clergy and churches. A system of deception has made it one of their primary goals to make sure that no one ever sees these 119 characters. And if they do see them, they will have no idea what these 119 characters even mean. If you agree with the suppression of information and deception of the public, in order to nullify, void or hide these 119 characters, and wish that no one including yourself see them, please stop the video now before proceeding. And now, here they are.
Kai exusin ep ordo Basilia Tum Angelon Tes Abasu on Noma Auto Ibres Time Abaddon Kai in Te L-A-N-I-K, Unnoma, X-I, Apollyon.
There are very few times in history where just a few words can shake the course of human civilization to its very core, or cast the fate of destiny, even before it has begun. The words you have just witnessed are some of the most important words in the Bible. They are the key to understanding civilization itself. Every hidden thing, every shadow, every secret society, and every occult organization, and every esoteric philosophy or ideology, is historically exposed, nullified, and laid bare and naked, by these mysterious, controversial and very obscure New Testament Greek words. And that is why they are, precisely that. It is all explained, by just 20 Greek words, or 119 characters. It is small enough to be a tweet on a Twitter feed. Just 119 characters long. But what it says, explains everything in our civilization today, from our holidays, to our academies, to our religions, to our secret societies, to military regalia, to politics, to even our very cultural rituals, practices and symbolisms. Where it all came from, why it all exists, and the reason it exists, the way that it does, and why there are so many inherent contradictions in our culture, because of them. Revelation 9:11 was written before what Revelation chapter 9 prophesies would ever happen. And most Christians, despite all the millions of Bibles, from the bookstores to their own homes, to even the hotel rooms they stay in on vacation, despite all these Bibles, the most amazing thing about these 20 words is that they remain completely hidden in plain sight to the vast majority of the world, including and most of all, to Christians. Precisely because of these professional liars and propagandists that have infiltrated, invaded and now dominate religious communities and institutions the world over. 20 words which most Christians not only cannot read, but cannot even understand in the slightest degree when they do read them. Because there has been a concerted effort which has lasted over 500 years to make sure and bury the meaning of its content from public view. Centuries of intentional disinformation, centuries of spending not millions, but billions of dollars on hiding it. All on hiding the potential impact of just 20 words.
Welcome to the Counter-Reformation Game Show. Let's play Apollyon, where our exciting Counter-Reformation contestants are challenged to draw a straight line from Revelation chapter 9 verse 11 to the word Apollyon without giving away any of our secrets. Get ready, go! Oh, I'm so sorry. It looks like all of our contestants have lost. While they did manage to skillfully avoid our secret, they weren't able to draw a straight line. And unfortunately, they also gave away our secret by providing a traced outline of its existence. Better luck next time, Counter-Reformationists, when we return to the exciting Counter-Reformation game. Let's play Apollyon!
The greatest command in the scripture, according to Christ, was to love the Lord thy God with all your heart, your mind, your soul and your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Loving God with all your mind is part of obedience to the greatest commandment. But when it comes to the book of Revelation, and especially the topic of Apollyon, instead of finding people, using their mind, and being well educated and informed about the background, history and culture and language of texts in this book, we find incredible immense rampant ignorance and superstition, and constant appeals to the authority of priests and preachers, or just completely wacky and blood-free association subjectivism. They go from the one extreme of authoritarianism, to the other extreme of subjectivism. And that bipolar dichotomy of authoritarianism and subjectivism, is what you will constantly see, not only about the subject of the Antichrist in general, but especially when it comes to the subject of Apollyon, in chapter 9 verse 11, is actually there by design. It is no accident. There is a huge vortex, spinning around the subject, full of everything anyone can possibly imagine, and in the very center of that vortex is complete and utter ignorance. Complete darkness. A huge void of information. A huge black hole. And here is what is interesting about this huge dark void. There is something in outer space called a black hole. They are collapsed stars which create a gravitational vortex in space, which is so strong that no light can escape. They call them black holes because they are invisible, and you cannot actually see them. And the way that scientists finally discovered the existence of black holes in outer space was not by seeing them with telescopes, but by seeing how they bent the light around them. Black holes are a perfect metaphor for exactly what the Counter-Reformation has done, with the reference John makes in verse 11. Verse 11 is like a collapsed star, which now attempts to pull all the light around that subject into this huge black hole, and never let any of it escape. Here is the black hole of Revelation chapter 9 verse 11. And what you are about to discover may change your view of the theological universe forever. Yes, black holes do exist both in the universe and in theology, and you are about to discover possibly the largest black hole in the theological universe in human history.
Lucifer, what is your problem?
Just that, sir.
Okay.
I'm a Christian, sir.
I'm pure and virtuous and wholesome and innocent. How can you say anything bad about me?
Sir, you need to be born again.
I am born again.
Now, did you just say that you were Lucifer?
I am Lucifer.
Okay, define Lucifer for me.
Pure, virtuous, wholesome, innocent individual that's out to help people.
Lucifer is?
Yeah.
Say that again. Lucifer is a pure, holy,
Virtuous.
virtuous. Now, is he the Lucifer that God created?
That's the same one.
Exactly what the Shriners and Masons teach is that Lucifer is light.
No.
And you're,
What
you're
about those
confirming it.
hospitals?
You know what, sir? Jesus said, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, we did not do these good deeds in your name. And you'll say, away from me, you workers of iniquity. I never knew you.
Jesus said it?
In Matthew chapter 5.
Mercy.
No.
That's hard to believe.
So you're a Christian and you don't know that. Actually.
No, I really am.
Okay, tell me about Jesus. Who is Jesus?
But he's my leader.
Is he the Son of God?
Yes, he is.
Is he the only? Okay, tell me about Jesus. Who is Jesus?
But he's my leader.
Okay, tell me about Jesus. Who is Jesus?
But he's my leader.
Sir, you need to be born again.
I am born again.
Now, did you just say that you were Lucifer?
I am Lucifer.
Okay, who is Jesus?
But he's my leader. I am Lucifer.
Okay, who is Jesus?
But he's my leader. I am Lucifer.
Okay.
But he's my leader. I am Lucifer.
Okay, tell me about Jesus. Who is Jesus?
I am Lucifer.
Okay, tell me about Jesus. Who is Jesus?
Lucifer.
Okay, tell me about Jesus. Who is Jesus?
Lucifer.
Okay, tell me about Jesus. Who is Jesus?
Lucifer.
Okay, tell me about Jesus. Who is Jesus?
Lucifer.
Okay, tell me about Jesus. Who is Jesus?
Lucifer.
Okay, tell me about Jesus. Who is Jesus?
Lucifer. Well, he's my leader.
On your screen, you're looking at a chart which lists references to pagan or polytheistic gods in the Bible. Throughout the Bible, approximately 41 pagan gods or polytheistic deities are mentioned, depending on how you count them. That's approximately 3.5 dozen references, which is actually a lot of references. For every 1.5 books in the Bible, there is a reference to a pagan deity. So there are a lot of references. But direct, unaltered references to pagan deities are not the norm, but the exception to how biblical authors made reference to pagan deities. Direct references are the clear exception. The reason this was the case is because mentioning the name of pagan gods was discouraged in Hebrew culture. It was written in the Torah, in Exodus chapter 23 verse 13. Quote, "And in all things that I have said unto you be circumspect, and make no mention of the name of other gods, neither let it be heard out of thy mouth." End quote. So while it does occur in the scripture, occasionally, almost 80% of the time, it is not the normal practice. And most of these direct references occur early in the Bible, in historical narrative references, not in prophetic material. For example, 91% of all direct references in the Old Testament occur before the book of 2 Samuel. And likewise, in the New Testament, 100% of all direct references occur in, or before, the book of Acts, in material which had been compiled from legal testimony and trial deposition narratives. And almost always, when the text is prophetic rather than historical narrative, it almost always uses euphemism and spelling variations to make such references, rather than direct references. And nowhere in the entire Bible, even tracing references to these deities, literally back thousands of years, even before Christ or BC, is there really ever a problem in identifying the pagan deities, despite the custom of the Bible to refer to these deities through spelling deviations, changing the way the name is spelled to mean something negative, or by referring to it through a euphemistic insult, or one of its titulary epithets. The references are really, hardly, ever mysterious or unknown. They are easily identifiable to biblical scholars, historians, linguists and researchers. Except when it comes to just one reference. In one single reference, out of these 41 references, all the normal rules applied everywhere else in the entire Bible will suddenly be inexplicably changed. For just one reference out of 41 references is 0.0, that is 0.02%. It's not even 1%. It is 0.02 of 1%. So this is an extremely odd exception. And what makes this exception even more odd is that it is actually one of the easiest to actually really identify. It wasn't one of the earliest Old Testament, ancient localized idol deities that disappeared with the Iron Age. It wasn't some exotic minor idol deity buried in the ruins of ancient Egypt. It is a reference to one of the most well-known and well-documented deities in the entire ancient Greco-Roman world. But, oddly enough, if you listen to counter-reformationist ministers, theologians and preachers, and specifically those with membership ties to esoteric secret societies, you will never even be told there is a reference to a very well-known pagan deity in that text at all. They will treat the text that refers to it as one of the biggest mysteries on planet Earth, and pretend no one has the faintest idea what that text is actually making a reference to. And or that they have finally solved this great grand mystery of what that text really means or refers to, and what will follow will be literally comical at best, or even dangerous at worst. And it is the only one of these 41 references in the entire Bible that they do this with. The only one, in 41 similar references, that they will behave that way. There is really no way you could possibly miss this reference, when it is literally one of the most obvious and easiest references in the entire Bible to identify, unless you just want to miss it on purpose. Unless there is a reason you just don't want to admit the reference is really there. That would be the only way you could possibly miss it, if you simply decided to do it on purpose. That is literally the only way you could actually get it wrong. To do so, on purpose. And, it's not mysterious. It is a factually obvious reference. In fact, it is so entirely obvious, the only way it can even remain fuzzy or ambiguous or mysterious, is if you simply hide the facts from people. That's it. You must literally hide the facts, to keep anyone from fully and easily realizing what verse 11 refers to. So, that is precisely what the Counter-Reformation does. It literally hides the facts of the text and of history from its audiences. If you have been sitting under the ministry of a Counter-Reformation minister, the basic facts of verse 11 and the history surrounding it has literally been intentionally hidden from you. So let's look at those facts right now and see what they are intentionally hiding from the public and from you about this text. On your screen is the Greek transliteration of Revelation chapter 9 verse 11. It reads, quote, "And they are having over them ruler, the messenger of the abyss. Name of him, in Hebrew, Abaddon. And in the Hellenic, name is Apollyon." End quote. The Greek word, exousin, is in the present tense. The Greek phrase, on noma xi, is in the present tense. And, the Greek phrase, on noma xi Apollyon, is also in the present tense. In fact, the entire verse is in the unbroken present tense. John has intentionally switched tenses. In verse 6, he uses the future tense to describe what this army going to do. But in verse 9, referring to breastplates of iron, he switches back to the past tense, because he is describing what he saw in his vision. As he approaches verse 11, he switches tenses to the present tense. Not the future tense. Not the past tense. But the present tense. That is a very important observation. These changes in tense are very important. He begins the switch to the present tense, in verse 10 referring to his symbolic reference to scorpions. Because as you saw already, that was a weapon Rome had in its possession, when John wrote. So he uses the present tense to refer to it. It existed in the present, so John switches his verbal tense to the present tense. And here in verse 11. The entire verse is in the present tense. The names he refers to in the text are all being referenced in the present tense. Even his statement, quote, "They have as king over them," end quote, is in the present tense. Meaning they have that ruling over them, right now. Not in the past. Not in the future. But right now. It is ruling over them, right now. And that is an incredibly important grammatical observation. Here's why. Monkey business is a slang expression defined by Google search as US slang or an idiomatic expression for wasting time or effort on silly or foolish projects. It is also associated with lying or crooked dealings, which is a perfect metaphor for what the Counter-Reformation has been doing with this text. They have been engaging in monkey business. Counter-Reformationists will tell you this text is either about Nero in the past, or about some mystery person or entity thousands of years in the future, at the end of the world. The people putting those claims out into the public already know themselves John is using the present tense when he makes that reference. They know this, but count on the fact that you do not. Recent surveys asking how much time a pastor spends on sermon preparation range from 8 to as much as 30 hours on average. Ministers who have spent 8 to 30 hours looking at Revelation 9:11 have obviously seen this text is in the present tense. Counter-Reformationists know, when it comes to this text, they only have 3 options. These 3 positions can be remembered by the 3 little monkeys, as in, M is for monkey. The first M stands for Mrs. Monkey. Mrs. Monkey will simply say John missed it and didn't know what he was talking about. He was either superstitious or stupid, or just wrong. But in the end, he just missed it. So you can remember this as Mrs. Monkey, because it's monkey business. This explanation is appealing to their more liberal public victims. Unfortunately, the claim is simply a bold-faced lie. And it really doesn't matter if a lie is a liberal lie, or conservative lie. A fact is a fact, and a lie is still a lie. You will see them offer Mrs. Monkey, made with the abrupt notation that there was nothing named Apollyon in classical Greek. Poof. John just missed it, or was stupid or didn't write it anyway. End of story. And they stick a big dead end sign on it. The Mrs. Monkey is not factual representation of classical Greek, which did, in fact, in classical Greek, not only make numerous and obvious references to, but even wrote entire discussions about, John's embarrassing illusion, which his contemporary audience was fully familiar with. Just as John, in the text, appeals to it. The second M stands for Mr. Monkey. Mr. or Mystery Monkey is concocted for moderates and traditionalists. Mr. Monkey simply pretends no one has any idea what John was talking about, because it is so amazingly, mysteriously mythical, or mystical. They hide it behind claims it refers to the past, for example to Nero, and hide it from the public, by spiritualizing or mystifying it, and then plastering it on Nero. Unfortunately, the counter-reformationist doesn't bother to tell their audiences that the founders of their very own traditions did not teach those views about the Antichrist. And the third M, which stands for Magic Monkey, again, is option 3. This one is created for all the fundamentalists and conservatives. Here, they simply lie about the content of the text. With this audience, they just cover it up, ignore it or dismiss the fact this verse is in the present tense. Ignore the facts, and place it all in the future, as a magical event. Magic Monkey says it's all future, despite what it says, and don't worry about the details because it's all magic, anyway. And that is how the Counter-Reformation lies to all three different audiences. All three audiences are simply being played, using the three monkeys. The people who are busy monkeying with this text, know, this text is unavoidably, in the present tense. The second thing that should be noticed, is that John is appealing to something his audience already knows. He is making a reference to the knowledge of his audience, and he states 4 things, all of which are stated in the present tense. 1. They have, present tense, a ruler or king over them, which is, in the present tense. And they have this king or ruler over them, right now. 2. This ruler they have over them, in the present tense, is the messenger of the abyss, not bottomless pit, but abyss, already right now, in the present tense. 3. This ruler is called Abaddon, by Jews in their native Hebrew, right now. And 4. In Greek, this, angel or messenger of the abyss, which is their ruler or king right now, has the name Apollyon, in Greek. Right now. Not future. Not past. But right now in the present. And it is a name. Not the generic descriptive word, destroy, or destruction. John is referencing a name that is spoken by Greeks and that his audience is already fully familiar with. He is appealing to what is called common knowledge among the audience of his own day. And all that is clear and straightforward. And there really is nothing mystifying or ambiguous in John's statement. It is not about the future. It is not about the past. It is about the present. So that rules out all the monkey business you are ever going to hear come out of the mouth of a counter-reformationist about this text. Counter-reformationists are really hoping you do not see this text is in the present tense. Because that one fact will utterly collapse the credibility of all those monkey business explanations. Here is how you can know they have been lying to you and the public about this reference. And that this is not simply a matter of innocent error or justifiable ambiguity. At the end of verse 11, John says his reference is called Apollyon in the Greek language, making a reference to something his audience is already fully aware of. John has made what he considers to be an obvious reference among his Greek-speaking audience, not a mysterious one. And as you are about to see, it is precisely that. It is, factually, obvious. This is not a matter of opinion. It is, mathematically and statistically, factually, obvious. And, remember, what you are about to see is already fully known by counter-reformationists. Here is what they do not tell you. Even though Greeks had developed a catalog of 270 heroes and gods, they only had 12 to 14 official Olympian gods, depending on how you counted them. If we take a list of all the names of all the Greek gods, and simply do a spelling match, we discover the following mathematical and statistical facts. On your screen is a spreadsheet, citing a complete list of Greek Olympian gods. Each letter of the name of the deities is matched to John's reference in Greek. If we look at the matches of Greek names with John's reference, in Revelation chapter 9 verse 11, no name of any Greek god randomly matches John's reference above even 50%. None of them are even close. Except one. Just one rises above a spelling match of 50% at all. And in that match of just this one name, we do not find a partial match of say 70% or 80% or even 90%. What we find in this match is a 100% match of every letter in the name, in Greek, precisely as John says in his text. John has done nothing but add an additional single letter to the name in Greek. It scores an 87% match with a spelling variant in keeping with the custom of biblical authors to use a variant spelling. But it scores a perfect 100% match with all the letters in the name in Greek, precisely as John refers his readers to the Greek name. Now counter-reformationists already know this is the truth. You are not seeing something new here they have never seen. They have all seen this, but they simply hide this from the public. Because they believe that lying to the public, for their political cause, is much more important than anything you should personally know that might involve, or even affect your salvation. They have made that decision for you. And they do not believe in the principle of informed consent. They have decided for you, and they believe they have the right to withhold that information from you. And that's not all they know about this reference. They also know that the odds against a random match in reference to this name are 93%. Or in other words, there is only a 7% chance this reference would be an accurate one by chance. And you will see more about that fact in a minute. But here, please note that this verse is in the present tense in 96 AD, and that it is factually and statistically an unmistakable reference to the Greek sun god Apollyon, also known as Apollo in Latin. But John doesn't just make a single reference to this Greco-Roman deity, he makes numerous references to it throughout the entire chapter, as you will see in a minute. And here in verse 11, he not only makes this direct reference to it by way of a spelling variation, he uses 3 other statements to point it out as well, in just this one verse. First, he says it is ruling over them as king, right now. So how is it ruling over them as king, right now in 96 AD? Once again, if you notice the Greek transliteration, it is in the present tense. The 4th word in this verse is the Greek word auton, and it is the 3rd person plural, personal pronoun, meaning the English word them. It is also in the genitive case, which means possession or origin, as in belonging to, or originating from. This is their king. Here you see John connects the present tense with his future prophecy about this army. And as you have already seen, all his references, from scorpions to locusts to breastplates of iron, all refer to the Roman army. Now he says, they have Apollyon as their king, which you now know was a reference to the Greco-Roman deity, Apollo. But even if you had no idea what Apollyon referred to, you would still end up discovering it to be Apollo, because of this statement. If you simply notice the present tense in this verse, and then research the history of the Roman Caesar, in power at the time of John's writing, you would find some very interesting things. And along with that, you would find some amazing light bending going on as well around it. Remember, whenever you see the light bending, it helps you see what they have made invisible. And here, once again, you will see the light being bent around this same black hole. For example, you would read in commentary publications put out by Zonder van Bres, like the one on your screen, that while that reference might be to Apollo, it is not a reference to Domitian, but to Nero, because Domitian's personal deity was Minerva. So it couldn't possibly refer to Domitian. And the commentator suggests that, despite the fact, he knows it is in the present tense and it was written around 96 AD. So that explanation would qualify as a stupid statement, But in this case, it's not because of stupidity. Zondervan, like most major Christian publishing houses, were purchased by Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation conglomerate a few years ago. Rupert Murdoch is a papal knight who actually to brag to a Georgetown University Catholic audience that he ran his media operations like the Jesuits. The Jesuits, of course, were the propaganda arm of the Catholic Church dedicated to intentionally spreading known lies and conducting assassinations to topple Protestant countries. They eventually got around to murdering popes as well. So Rupert Murdoch is a self-confessed counter-Reformation propagandist who has made it his goal to emulate Jesuit disinformationists. And since he has purchased all these Christian publishing companies, they all now reflect his counter-Reformation propaganda statements in their content. And what you are seeing is Zondervan Publishing now reflecting the primary mission statement of their new owner: dissemination of counter-Reformation propaganda. The person issuing that explanation in that Zondervan Press published commentary fully know their assertion that that text is a reference to Nero is a stupid one for a number of reasons. But they are putting it forth because that's now the counter-Reformation's current propaganda line. John has already addressed Nero in the Sealed Judgments, where he openly and consistently uses the past tense references and even past tense symbolism. John has progressed on his timeline now by decades, past Nero, past Vespasian, past Titus, and he is now prophesying future events under the trumpet judgments. And he makes a reference, in passing, to the present tense, which, as this commentator knows, and admits, is under Domitian. This commentator is not really that stupid. He's just dishonest. And in exchange for some fame and fortune from Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, this commentator is attaching his name to counter-Reformation propaganda. But he knows, he really does know this. He knows this text is neither directed at anything in the past, nor does it have anything to do with Nero. He already knows that. But he just assumes that you, as a member of the consumer public of Zondervan Publications, do not. So you can see the light bending. Here's how you can know he is lying to you. While it was true that Domitian liked Minerva, which was the Latin version of Athena, this commentary author also knows that Domitian was a really big fan of prophecy. And like virtually all Greco-Romans, Domitian looked to Apollo for prophecy and all his decisions which were based on them. Which, of course, this commentator conveniently makes no mention of at all. Despite the fact he knows this. If you have done enough research to write a commentary, you couldn't help but know it. And this commentator also knows, as anyone who researches this subject will soon find out, that Domitian actually even minted coins in honor and gratitude to Apollo, with Apollo's image on them, and Apollo's sacred prophecy bird, the crow, which was used in divining prophecies from Apollo. These coins were minted to honor Apollo, for the prophecies Domitian was being given from him. Coins which this commentary author has even probably seen himself personally. But that's not all that this commentary author strangely forgot to even mention to his audience. The Zondervan Press commentator, working for Rupert Murdoch, also knows that Domitian commissioned a sculpture of something called Domitian's genius. The word genius was used by the Romans in the same way that modern people might use the idea of a guiding spirit or a guardian angel. It was a spirit they considered present from the moment of their birth that would guide their destiny throughout the rest of their life. And it also implied an expression of their own personal individual spiritual essence. And here on your screen is the sculpture of the Caesar Domitian's genius, which this commentary author forgot to mention. It is really a rather famous sculpture, which this commentator is already fully aware of. And this commentator also knows that Domitian's genius is unmistakably a replication of Apollo, which you now see next to it. And because of this, historians prior to the era of counter-Reformation propagandizing for Rupert Murdoch also regularly deduced the rather obvious conclusion that Domitian saw himself as the incarnation of Apollo, in the same way that Egyptian pharaohs saw themselves as the incarnations of Horus. And, by the way, that is not an accident, as the Zondervan commentator already fully knows. And this Zondervan commentator also knows that in order to spread counter-Reformation religious propaganda through a commentary published by Zondervan Press, it is very important that he not only does not bring up any of those historical facts to his audience, he also needs to deflect his audience for absolutely no apparent reason and without any basis in fact in this text back to Nero, to make sure and steer them away from what John is actually really exposing. When John wrote, "They have Apollo as their king," in 96 AD, referring to Domitian, John knew precisely what he was saying and why he was saying it. His audience, and even that author from Zondervan Press, they all fully knew of Domitian's use of prophecies from Apollo. They all knew of Domitian's coins minted in honor of Apollo. And most importantly of all, they all knew about the sculpture of Domitian's genius as Apollo. And they also all knew John was making no such reference to Nero, using the present tense, in 96 AD. Including the author of that Zondervan Press commentary. And now you know that, as well. And you didn't have to pay anything for that information. Sadly, traditional Christian publishing companies are no longer good sources of information for the Christian community. They are entirely owned and controlled by billionaire counter-Reformation propagandists, such as Papal Knight and Jesuit activist Rupert Murdoch. The second reference John makes again to Apollo in verse 11 is pointing out the title, the Angel of the Abyss. Why was this title a reference to Apollo? As you learned earlier, the Greek term, abuso, is intentionally mistranslated as bottomless pit into English as an effort at misdirection. It is actually the English word abyss. And just like the English word still means today, it was a reference to the watery deep. Either the depths of the oceans or the subterranean rivers we call aquifers today. With the one additional element, from Roman thanatology, that it was also associated with the place of the dead. Archaeologists have discovered numerous paintings and mosaics of Apollo in the catacombs. And often these references to Apollo are merged with Christ in what Catholic historians call the Christian catacombs. Apollo was associated with the abyss, and was even seen as a symbol of resurrection to these Romans. Why was this the case? Because, remember, that Apollo was the sun god. And remember that the abyss was considered the place of the dead in Roman thanatology, and you will quickly realize what the connection was to Apollo, as the angel of the abyss, and in the Roman catacombs, was an obvious reference to. If you lived in the ancient world, and you wanted to find out where Apollo was coming out from, or rising from, in the morning, you would travel as far east as you could. But eventually, you would run out of land, and run into a vast unfathomable ocean. If you stood at the edge of that land, and watched for Apollo to rise in the morning, you would see him come out of the depths of the ocean, also referred to as the abuso, or the abyss. Precisely as the term means, in English today. If you followed Apollo west, as far as you could, you would eventually run into that same vast unfathomable ocean in the west. And if you stood on the edge of land, and watch Apollo sink beyond the horizon at sunset, you would see Apollo return to the depths of the sea again, or the abyss. So every day, Apollo would both rise out of the abyss, and return to the abyss. Remembering, that was also what Romans thought of as the place of the dead, you can see that they saw in Apollo both death and resurrection. And so, among Nicolaitans who were Roman syncretists, who mixed Roman paganism with Christ, it would be quite natural for Roman syncretists to interpret Apollo as Christ, precisely as we see depicted in the Roman catacombs. But this gives amazing depth of meaning to John's prophecy that this future Roman constituency of the Antichrist, from verse 1, now in the present tense, have Apollo as their king right now. And John's message in verse 11 was that that was going to continue to be the case, despite the changes in appearances. So you see, Apollo really was the angel of the abyss, precisely as John states in verse 11. And finally, the third and last reference John overtly makes to Apollo, before literally naming him, by way of a spelling variant, is that he is called Abaddon in Hebrew. And naturally, the counter-reformationists like to spit out their denials and obfuscations on this last reference as well. You will hear them say, "Oh look, we have no idea what that means." Abaddon was a reference to the Gentile sun god, from Hebrew. And this reference goes all the way back to the Exodus, in ancient Egypt. And all the way forward to Apollo, in the Roman Empire. And here is again, how you know counter-reformationists are simply lying to the public, about what they know, about all this. When John mentions the word, Apollyon, and then refers his readers to the Greek language to understand it, that means you have to look it up in Greek. If you follow his instruction, you will find a 100% match to his reference, from Greek. Now he is referring his readers, to Hebrew. And the name, Abaddon. In Hebrew the word, Abaddon, does mean, destruction. But that is not all it means. And he doesn't say that as a description. He says, that term is a name, or something Apollo is actually called, or referred to, by Hebrews in John's day. If you look the word Abaddon up in the Jewish encyclopedia, you will find it was a word that referred to a compartment in Gehenna, the place of punishment in the afterlife, for Gentile sinners. Or, let's be very precise here, historically and culturally, it was the compartment of Gehenna, reserved for Roman heathens. It was the place in the afterlife, for pagan Romans. One of the gates of Gehenna was said to be in the ocean. As you know, the Egyptians worshipped the sun as well. In Egyptian theology, the sun was originally worshipped as Amun-Ra. It later became associated with Horus, who is the firstborn of Isis and Osiris. Horus was symbolized as a falcon or hawk. The two eyes of Horus symbolized the sun and the moon, or the evening Venus and the morning Venus, or the rising sun and the setting sun. When Moses pronounced the death of the firstborn, it was Horus, the firstborn of Isis and Osiris, who was the target of that judgment. Horus was associated with the firstborn of Egypt, because he was the firstborn of Isis and Osiris, and Horus was the personal protector of Egypt's pharaoh, who was considered himself to be the incarnation of Horus. In the same way that Domitian put forth the idea he was the incarnation of Apollo. You have seen the famous symbol of Horus, the Eye of Horus, or also sometimes called the Eye of Ra. John connects Apollo to Horus by way of this reference. The Greek historian Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century BC, points out this equation in his own writings. And John, writing 5 centuries later, also makes that same direct link invoking the Hebrew term, Abaddon. How? Because, when you look up the term Abaddon, you will find it comes from Hebrew, and means destroyer, which the Strong's lexicon explains as meaning, a destroying angel. But the term doesn't have the word angel in it. It just means destroyer. You will see most sources track that Hebrew word to a few uses in what is called the wisdom literature. Job, Psalms and Proverbs. And that is where they stop with it, telling you nothing more. But the term Abaddon comes from the Hebrew root word Abad. And the first place that term is used is in reference to the Exodus in Egypt. And in fact, it is first used in reference to the very plague of locusts. And John has just finished several verses talking about the symbolism of locusts. And here we see another Old Testament reference to it. But that's not all. That root word, Abad, means to perish. Perish, as in what happens to sinners when they die. Abad means to be destroyed, or perish, but Abaddon refers to the one causing the destruction. So you have two references, the destroyer and the ones destroyed. There is nothing about an angel in either term. But obviously, a destroyer by definition is also an agent or cause of destruction. Therefore, a bringer of it. Horus, as the firstborn of Isis and Osiris, symbolically or spiritually perished in the plague of the death of the firstborn. His worship and will, in hostile defiance against the God of Moses, was also the cause of the destruction that came upon Egypt. So he was both the destroyed and the destroyer in the Passover exodus from Egypt. So how does this name of a place in Gehenna also refer to the name of the sun god deity, Horus, which later becomes equated with Apollo or Apollyon as John calls him? Jewish theology taught that the sun was not a god to be worshipped. And in fact, the actual fire that the sun carried across the sky was not the fire of its glory, as a deity, but that these were literally the fires of hell. Because that's where it would cause people to end up, if you worshipped it. John echoes this sentiment later in Revelation, where he identifies this same fire as the lake of fire, in chapters 19 and 20, where followers of the Antichrist will end up and be punished. So John associates the fire of the sun with the same fires of Gehenna that punish the wicked. Here's how that connection was made. In Roman thanatology, Apollo would descend into the abuso every evening, and then re-emerge from it the next morning, rising from the place of the dead to light the sky. But as is explained in the Jewish Encyclopedia, Jewish tradition speculated that the angel of the sun would descend into this place they called Abaddon of Gehenna, and take the fire from there, and carry across the sky to light the day. As the fire burned out, the angel of Abaddon would return there at sunset, and emerge the next morning with new fire to carry across the sky, until it burned out again, and then he would return in the evening at sunset, to get more fire. Thus the fires of the sun were the fires of Gehenna, the place of the dead, for Roman pagans. According to John, Jews in the Greco-Roman Empire identified this with Apollo, the sun god, and connected him to Egyptian sun worship, in the form of Horus, as well. And this fact was borne out in secular Greco-Roman history by Herodotus, thus confirming John's reference to the Hebrew usage of the term Abaddon to refer to Apollo Horus. Names of Egyptian priests to Horus bore the combined name of Horus and Apollo, as Hor-Apollo in Egypt, and temples to Horus assimilated the Greco-Roman name Apollo with them and their cities. So you see, John was being as thorough as anyone could have possibly been in his day, with the numerous and repetitive ways he mentions this deity. From his reference to the sculpture of Domitian's genius, to its title as the Angel of the Abuso or Abyss, to his reference to it as the Hebrew Abaddon, and its connection to Egyptian sun worship, to finally and literally, its very name. His reference was completely unmistakable. And, as obvious as he makes himself in verse 11, technically if verse 11 had never been written at all, anyone familiar with the historical setting and culture that John was writing in would have made a connection to Apollo already numerous times before even getting to verse 11. How is that? Because in verses 1 through 10, John has already made numerous symbolic allusions to this Greco-Roman deity, which become obvious after you see Apollo specifically mentioned in verse 11. And here is how. There are 10 verses, from verse 1 to verse 10, that precede John's overt references to Apollo, in verse 11. But out of these 10 verses, at least 8 of these 10 verses make indirect allusions to Apollo. Or in other words, 80% of the preceding text is saturated with allusions to Apollo. 80%. These verses serve as a build-up to the final climax of the text in verse 11, where he drops the suspense and makes his overt references to the deity he is alluding to, that will rule over the army of the Antichrist. An army, he points out, beginning with his very first verse about them, in verse 1, that is filled with constant contradiction and overt hypocrisy. And ultimately, it is an army that will be destroyed by God, beginning in verse 12. In verse 1, John invokes the Lucifer text from Isaiah chapter 14 verse 12. We will look in depth into the topic of Luciferianism and Lucifer, as translated in Isaiah 14, but for now, it is sufficient to simply note here that the text in Isaiah references a Semitic deity associated with sun worship. The translation of the Hebrew term used there means shining one. Apollo was addressed in prayers, in Greek, as Phoebus, which means, as you might have guessed by now, the shining one. In verse 2 it mentions he opens the abyss. As noted already, it was Apollo who was considered the angel of the abyss. In verse 3, the text says that locusts come out of the abyss. Apollo was known as Parnopius, which translated means, the god of locusts. In verse 5, as noted in the previous videos, John makes reference to the Roman scorpion bow. Apollo was called the Hekatos, which means the fall shooter, and was known as the god of archers. In verse 6, as you saw in the previous videos, John writes they will worship death and not perceive it. Apollo was believed to be the god of sudden death. It was believed his arrows were the cause of all sudden deaths. In verse 7, he says despite the fact they have the faces of men. In verse 8, he says they have hair of women. Apollo wore long hair like a woman, despite the fact he was a man. In verse 9, he mentions the sound of multi-horse chariots. This was the signature visual image of Apollo, riding across the sky, pulled by 4 horses. And in verse 10, John mentions the scorpion bow again. And once again, noting Apollo was known as the god of archers. So that is literally 80% of the text, with allusions to Apollo, before he ever even gets to verse 11, and refers to him by name, by way of a spelling variant. Now we come back to verse 11, with some closing observations about what John does with the spelling variant he uses, to refer to Apollo. As you can see, there is really no way someone professionally trained in biblical studies, or how to study the scriptures, could honestly miss these overtly redundant references to Apollo in this text. Unless they simply wanted to do it on purpose. So just how big is a censorship cover-up concerning this text in Revelation chapter 9? Well, as you can see, it's massive. It's not just a single word or a single verse. It's the entire text of 11 straight verses involving multiple references and allusions and surrounding historical contexts, which are both well-known and highly documented. They hide the reference to Apollo Phoebus, the shining or radiant one, in verse 1, behind the claim that the verse refers to the end of the world, when they fully know it does not. They do actually know this. They intentionally and knowingly hide John's reference to Apollo in verse 2, as the angel of the abyss, by hiding the very word abyss itself, and actually replacing it with a fictional term, borrowed straight out of medieval superstitions, as the bottomless pit, instead. They hide the reference to Apollo Pernopios, meaning, of the locusts, in verse 3, by claiming it's a reference to literal bugs, when they fully know it isn't, and John identifies them as men, in verse 7. They hide the reference to Apollo Hekatos in verse 5, by pretending John's references to Roman crossbows, previously known as scorpions, never existed. And they have never heard of such a thing. They hide the reference to Apollo as the god of sudden death, in verse 6, by literally twisting its words into a completely bizarre reference to zombieism, and a medieval idea of living dead incapable of death, requiring the suspension of literally all the known laws of physics in the entire universe to even ever happen. They hide the reference in verse 8 to the unusual practice of Apollo wearing his hair like a woman, to refer to the fuzz on magical demon bugs from their fictitious bottomless pit that goes into the center of the earth. They hide the reference to the time frame in verse 9 of when in the Roman Empire, all the sun gods in Rome were merged under the identity of Apollo Sol, coinciding with the emergence of Lorica segmentata, made of iron. By completely ignoring the reference altogether, or claiming it as a reference to nylon Kevlar made of plastic polymers. Never mind, the text says, made of iron. They hide the reference to Apollo's multi-horse chariot, which pulled him across the sky, in verse 9, by also completely ignoring it, and simply pretending it isn't there. They hide the reference to John's use of the present tense, in verse 11, to refer to the time of Domitian, whose sculpture of his genius was clearly and unmistakably Apollo. And they even attempt to hide history about the Roman Caesar Domitian, in order to deflect John's references to either Nero or the end of the world. And they hide what the Hebrew word Abaddon really meant, as a reference to the fires of Gehenna, carried by the sun, which the Gentiles were worshipping in their practices of sun god worship, and which clearly communicated among Jews the idea of their damnation for doing it, extending the damnation all the way back to worship of the Egyptian sun god, Horus, who the Greco-Roman deity sun god Apollo was clearly and openly stated, and fully recognized and known, cognate for, both in the Greco-Roman world, and even in Egypt. And finally, of course, they hide John's direct reference to the very name itself, by way of the spelling variant of a single letter, which was precisely the way every other god in the entire Bible was ever referred to, in prophetic literature, without exception. Which, of course, they also already fully know. In short, they hide the entire text behind bold-faced lies and unashamed appeals to ideas and beliefs, from medieval magic bugs, magic pits, magic people who fly through the sky, and magic stories of the living dead, incapable of death. Hoping desperately that all this magical misdirection will throw a magical spell of delusion on their intentionally deceived audiences. And unfortunately, it sadly often works. And not only do they intentionally and deliberately hide all this information from the public about the sheer facts of the text itself from their unfortunate victimized audiences, they even hide the hundreds of years, and even centuries, of legitimate and sound biblical scholarship on the subject of Revelation 9:11 from their audiences as well. It is not like any of this is some kind of new discovery. It's not the faddish recent finding of some very theoretical reconstructionist interpretation. It's not some new fact, just recently dug up by an archaeologist's discovery in Rome or the Middle East. In fact, this text has been identified openly and consistently by biblical scholars as a reference to Apollo, going back literally hundreds of years, all the way to the Reformation, and even before that. This is not some kind of new chic discovery, buried in the back ends of some hard-to-read archaeological journal. This is simply what counter-reformationists have maliciously hidden from the public, for the sole and intentional purpose of simply deceiving them. Long before the Reformation ever even occurred in Europe, and even long before there was an organized church institution in Western society, early Christian manuscript copyists saw this reference as such an obvious one. In one manuscript, they simply dropped John's variant spelling altogether, and copied the name, Apollo, right into their text of the Greek manuscript itself. Possibly thinking they were simply correcting a spelling error concerning the name. During the Reformation, this reference was openly illustrated in cartoon satire. One woodcut, which has been shown on this channel, in the opening screen, shows Constantine as the emperor with no clothes, pointing to the sun, which of course, was a known reference to Apollo. Biblical scholarship since the Reformation, both old and new, for literally hundreds of years, has confirmed with very little ambiguity, in historical context, this was an open and obvious reference to Apollo. John F. Gill wrote in 1746, in his commentary on Revelation 9:11, that quote, Apollyon is the same as Apollo, the god of the heathens, who has his name from destroying. End quote. In 1830, the Edinburgh Encyclopedia wrote, quote, there can be no doubt that the Pythian Apollo is the same as Ob, and Abaddon, of the Hebrews, which the Greeks translated literally as Apollyon. End quote. In 1878, Andrew Robert Fawcett wrote in his Fawcett's Bible Dictionary, quote, as the twofold names of Abba, Hebrew, and Father, Greek, combine Jew and Gentile in a common salvation, so Satan's two names, Abaddon and Apollos, combine them in a common destruction. End quote. In 1956, the Anchor Bible Dictionary, a scholarly publishing project, produced as a research resource for professional ministers and theological students, now owned by Yale Press, wrote in its commentary on Revelation 9:11, quote, the name Apollo, Greek Apollon, was often linked in ancient Greek writings with the verb Apollyon or Apollyo, meaning to destroy. From the time of Grotius, Apollyon has often been taken here to be a play on the name Apollo. The locust was an emblem of this god, who poisoned his victims, and the name Apollyon may be used allusively in Revelation, to attack the pagan god, and so indirectly the Roman Emperor Domitian, who liked to be regarded as Apollo incarnate. End quote. And even into our very own present day, there are numerous references to this fact, which one can find all over the internet. From bloggers, to biblical researchers. So there is simply no excuse for ignorance about this text, other than willful intent to deceive, or remain so. The overt reference in Greek, by way of a spelling variant, the references to its titles in other languages, the saturation of symbolic allusions throughout the entire text, John's clear usage of the present tense in 96 AD, and the consistency of biblical scholarship throughout the ages, to easily identify this reference as a reference to Apollo, lead counter-Reformation propagandists, who pretend to be Christian clergy, with no morally justified excuses, except willful deceit. There is no problem in identifying Apollyon as Apollo. What there is a huge problem of embarrassment over what that means, once you realize it does refer to Apollo. And that is precisely why all this has been suppressed by counter-Reformationists. Informed consent is an important moral, ethical and legal foundation for much of our current uniform commercial code, civil and human rights law that we have today, and is even cited in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, where it is known today as the Consent of the Governed Clause. Now that you have seen what they have hidden in Revelation chapter 9 verse 11, in the next video, you will be shown why they have hidden it. And that revelation will prove to be even bigger than what they have hidden. Why would anyone care what it says in verse 11 anyway? Whether it is Apollo or not? What's the big deal? There is a huge reason this has to be hidden by counter-reformationists. Because if they don't, they are practically admitting to their own audiences, they are plunging not only the spiritual destiny of millions into damnation, into the fires of Gehenna, they are even destroying planet Earth with their religious and spiritual practices. When given the choice between whether or not your eternal salvation should be at risk, or the successful restoration of the Roman Empire, counter-reformationists chose the good of the kingdoms of this world, not your soul. And that decision was an intentional decision, made without your informed consent. Find out why in the next video. Thank you for watching.